Unfortunately, there was a big government crowd at Philadelphia even in 1787. It was Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, and they argued that without the government there can be no freedom, and as the government protects your freedom, it is the government that gives you freedom. And in bad times, the government can take the freedom back, and in good times, the government can give the freedom to you and you can exercise it. Fortunately, because we have a Bill of Rights, we know that Madison and the small government people and those who believe in natural rights, as Jefferson had written in the Constitution, prevailed. And the Constitution was enacted only because the Bill of Rights was promised to be added, which it was 3 years later. And so, our right to think as we wish, to speak as we think, to say what we speak, our right to worship or not to worship, our right to associate or not to associate, our right to protect ourselves. If anybody tells you that the Second Amendment was written to protect hunters' rights, there's some liberal crackpot from New York or California. The Second Amendment was written to allow you to protect yourself when the police can't or won't. And it was written to allow you to use it against the government if it is taken over by tyrants. All of these rights were written down. It's impossible to write down all of the rights, so they wrote down the Ninth Amendment. And the Ninth Amendment said, just because we wrote down some rights in the preceding 8 amendments doesn't mean these are the only rights that we've written down. But we have created a limited government. It can't do everything. It can only do the specific 17 powers, specific 17 things we have said in the Constitution. One of my favorite amendments, if you have to pick one, is the 4th. Because the 4th Amendment stands for the greatest right there is after the right to life, and that is the right to be left alone. Today we call this the right to privacy. It guarantees that there are areas of human activity immune from intrusion by the government. And that immunity is as natural to us as our thoughts and our words and our expressions, and the government is obliged under the Constitution to respect that immunity itself and to protect us when someone else tries to interfere with it. Now, all of these things sounded wonderful in the Bill of Rights, and they sound nice as I articulate them to you today. Unfortunately, we have a sordid history of the violation of these rights. Think about it. In the second presidency, that's John Adams, the second president of the United States, the country enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts were written out of fear of the French. Oh, how the times have changed. The French Revolution was going on in France. The government here was worried that something similar might happen. Jefferson had been the ambassador to Paris before we were the United States of America under the Constitution. He was the ambassador under the Articles of Confederation. So they wrote this bizarre law which said if you're French and you want to be an American citizen, you have to be here for 14 years. Oh, and by the way, if you are here, French, American, alien, foreign, natural born, whatever you are, if you criticize the government and bring it into disrepute, specifically the president, the cabinet, the Supreme Court, and members of Congress, you can be charged with violating the Alien and Sedition Acts and sent to jail for 2 years. How could the same generation, in some instances the very same human beings who wrote, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech," words that all of you can recite, the opening lines of the First Amendment. How could the same human beings who wrote that also write a law which says you can go to jail if you criticize us. By the way, did you note who was missing from that list of those that you can't criticize? The vice president. It was Jefferson. He didn't care what they said about him. You remember a little bit of history. In those days, people didn't run on tickets. Everybody ran for president. Whoever finished first became president. Whoever finished second became vice president. Can you imagine how bizarre this would be in today's times? Nevertheless, John Adams had a vice president who hated him, and Jefferson had a president he didn't want to talk to, but that was the law at the time. Congressman Matthew Lyons, a small government Jeffersonian anti-federalist from Vermont, said that President Adams was more interested in pomp and circumstance than he was in the powers of the presidency. Now, all right, Adams went along with that. And then Congressman Lyons went a little too far, and he made fun of the president's waistline. And he referred to the President of the United States as his rotundity. And for that, Congressman Lyons was indicted, tried, and convicted of violating the Alien and Sedition Acts because he brought the presidency into disrepute by mocking his waistline. Now, if you're from Boston or New Jersey or Chicago or New Orleans, you'll appreciate the second part of this story. Congressman Adams' jail term began 2 months before Election Day. So he ran for re-election to the Congress from his jail cell in Massachusetts. And he won. He was re-elected. Look, we can kid around about the anomalies in history, about how a country that complained about a king suppressing speech acquired power and itself suppressed speech. Over 25 people spent a total of over 50 years, if you add up all their jail times together, in federal jails during the presidency of John Adams because of their speech. What about the First Amendment? It's pretty clear. The Congress overlooked it and the courts overlooked it. That's why it's important that you understand what your rights and liberties are, because a government that doesn't like you, or worse yet, a government that hates you, or worse yet, a government that fears you, will overlook the natural rights that are yours and will not protect those rights, and you may just have to protect them yourself. This is a pattern that repeats over and over in our history. During the Civil War, whatever you think of the nobility of the Northern cause or the treacherous nature of the Northern cause, whichever side you're on. Was it a war against slavery, or was it a war for power? Was it a war against states' rights? Was it a war to collect tariffs from ports in the South? Whatever you think. Abraham Lincoln locked up 3,000 newspaper reporters, not soldiers shooting at him, but newspaper reporters in the North, because they criticized the war effort. And he argued that they were too dangerous to be set free, too dangerous to talk to lawyers, too dangerous to be brought before juries. Does any of this sound familiar? During World War I, the Congress enacted the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act made it a crime to try and talk someone out of supporting the war. A crime to talk. Ask Abe Gitlow, an immigrant from Eastern Europe, who went into the basement of a friend's repair shop and cobbled together, if you're my age, you remember this, one of those old-fashioned mimeograph machines. You remember those? It was a barrel with a stencil with ink on the inside. If you spinned it at the right speed and you put the paper in the right place, it would reproduce on the paper what you had cut on the stencil. So he cuts on the stencil, if you're drafted, don't go. The war is unlawful, resist it. And he takes these crudely printed documents and he hurls them off the roof of a tenement where he lives on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Somebody gets it and gives it to the government, and he's prosecuted, tried, and convicted and sentenced to 20 years in jail for exercising his free speech. At the trial of Mr. Gitlow, the government couldn't find anybody who found or read or understood the pamphlets. He wrote them in Yiddish.